Hello and welcome to a review that is also perhaps kind of a bit of a rant. So, The Grain Kings by Keith Roberts. This is a book that I failed to enjoy on any level. I was actually resentful and annoyed and at times bored while I was reading it. I was not a happy camper. I bitterly resented this book by the end of it, and even though I didn't enjoy it, I'm not for a second pretending that Keith Roberts isn't a good author. I'm not saying that he can't write, he clearly can. He writes beautifully, lyrically, descriptively, but I didn't enjoy any of it. And in order to explain why, I have to start at the beginning here. So, here is my copy of The Grain Kings by Keith Roberts, which I'm pretty sure I bought in response to some YouTubers doing reviews saying how good an author Keith Roberts was. Now, he's the best-selling author of Pavane. It says so right here. I couldn't find Pavane. I found this one. It sat on my shelf for a while. And I came to it when I was in the mood for some good old sci-fi adventure. I just read a few things that weren't really sci-fi. I was back to get back in my sci-fi groove. Look at this cover. This looks like your classic 70s sci-fi cover, and indeed this is from 77. Published by Granada Publishing in Panther Book 77. Keith Roberts had been recommended by the readers of science fiction. That cover, which by the way on the back it says is by Chris Foss. You've got this amazing, vivid, black and white, black and orange type, or is it yellow, mechanical thing, The Grain Kings, and I'm going to read you the back. I don't often read the book. By the way, my copy is in pretty good condition. I am going to hang on to it. I might try reading at some stage. The cover wasn't bent. All of it's in good condition. And, while I don't often do this, here's what it says. We reap and we thresh grain for half the world. We are the Grain Kings raised of old. They call them the Grain Kings, gigantic mechanical monarchs of the wheat-bearing plains that were once the frozen Alaskan wastes. Whole ecosystems in themselves. They can supply the food so desperately needed by the teeming millions of our overpopulated planet. Not that far into sci-fi anymore, really. But even now, as the whole world waits in hungry suspense, the great powers battle for control of the prairies, and two competing combine harvesters find they're heading on a course of collision. Da-da-da-da. A collision with catastrophic consequences, not only for the hundreds of crewmen aboard each massive machine, but for the future survival of mankind. It is awesome, evocative, and brilliantly inventive. The Grain Kings demonstrates the full range of Keith Roberts' storytelling genius. And underneath it, it tells us once again, Chris Foss did the cover. Science fiction, Panther sci-fi, The Grain Kings, Granada, you all lied to me. So, anyway, picked this up. Read the little previewy thing, which is about Keith Roberts. And I started on chapter 1. Chapter 1 is Weihnachtsabend, which since I've just come back from Swiss-German speaking Switzerland, clearly we've got a bit of German happening there, and there's a Nacht, so there's a night in question. Okay, so it occurs in an alternative, it starts with an alternative worldish, but you learn it by increments quite organically. Germany didn't lose World War II at all, but instead joined with England to create some sort of uber empire in which German is still speaking, but English is as well. Anyway, we follow the protagonist, whose name I've already forgotten. He works for Ministry of something, communications? Something, I don't know. And he's on the way to a Christmas-type party at this isolated estate with a whole heap of security, all talking German at the gate. And he and a girl called Miss Hunter, I don't care what his name was really. Miss Hunter is in the car with him. They hooked up once in the past, but she dumped him for some other guy. Anyway, she works at the same agency, and they're on the way to this party. It's an okay sort of story, and in one sense I think it's much better in 2024 than it would have been in 77. if only because we have Google Translate. And I don't have to wonder what all the German meant. So I could just hold translate over the page. It would translate more or less accurately the paragraph of German that I would otherwise have had to just double guess what it meant. A lot of authors did that. By the 70s it was becoming thankfully rarer. I don't love it. I think I see what Roberts was trying to do there, but you know. So we've got our protagonist, and I will check on what his name is. And he's at this party, Mainwaring, which sounds a lot more Jane Austen to me than it does sci-fi, but that's fine. Anyway, Mainwaring is one of those names. It's English, but it comes across as German, perhaps because the Germanic tribes essentially are a lot of England. Anyway, we've got Mainwaring and we've got Miss Hunter, and he's at this party where there's some weird stuff happening, and there's a whole things about the Empire that we don't really talk about. And even before he went to this party, there's some resistance that is opposing the Empire, which is trying to contact him, and he's very worried about it because bad things to happen in this empire to people who are contacted by the resistance. It seems like the main resistance comes out of America. England and Germany have combined. A lot of the rest of Europe is under their control, but there's still some opposition. It's nothing spelt out. The narrative is interesting in its own way. It's deeply descriptive. By about 10 to 15 pages into this thing, I decided, okay, this is one of those books where you've got the first chapter happens way before the actual part of the narrative, and that first chapter sets you up to understand where the story is in the world. And I was a bit impatient. It wasn't a bad story, but I was ready to get on to the main story, the Grain Kings, yeah? So him and this girl hook up, and then they pretend she didn't exist, and then there's some weird German reenactment of a wild hunt. Who knows? Who knows what the actual hunted animal is? There's some weird shit with kids being terrified by a version of Black Nick, or Father Christmas, or something. I'm not sure what was happening there. And it ends with bad things happening to Mainwaring. It seemed kind of pointless, but I bore with it. At the end, I thought, I don't see how this is going to lead into the main event, but, you know, okay, I've read it. I was a bit bored, but not terribly. So then, the next chapter is called The White Boat, and we start with a girl called Becky, who's on some miserably poor rocky coast in the United Kingdom, possibly. She's in a coracle. I like the fact that she had a coracle, and she's pulling up lobster pots. So there's a food theme there. I get that. The white boat in question is possibly a yacht that comes into the bay and mystifies her. This is also well written if you like stream of consciousness, heavily descriptive. Again, we're full on the poetic with the water sloshing against the boat. But the whole thing is third person from Becky's point of view. And Becky is so basically that she's barely verbal. She's perhaps not a dishonest narrator, but she isn't intentionally dishonest, but she knows so little about anything that we, following Becky, can't even understand the things that she doesn't understand. Huck Finn does something similar. Huckleberry Finn. Huck Finn is naive. But the way Twain wrote it is we, the reader, can understand from Finn's naivety the things that he isn't saying. Becky is so basic that we can't even understand the things that she doesn't understand. And after a few pages of this, I'm going, have they put the wrong cover on the wrong story? But check the top. No, it definitely says the Grain Kings. And I'm a bit early there. It definitely says the White Boat. And finally I came to the realization that this novel is not a novel. It doesn't have a lot of chapters, I thought. Only 7, and they've got kind of random names, but I don't spend that much time reviewing the chapter names before I start books, unless it's something like Offit where it's humorful. Maybe I should. This is a collection of short stories, and Granada Panther Science Fiction fooled me into buying it. and reading it in the assumption that it was a novel, and by now I am furious. Short story collections are things that I can do in very specific circumstances, and I wanted a novel that I could sit down and read cover to cover. So by the end of the White Book, it was incredibly obvious that this was a short story. How... Damn you, Panther, for misleading me in this way. I shall never buy a new book from you again. Probably. So, nowhere on the back cover, nowhere on the front cover, nowhere on the inside does it mention anything about the short stories, and I wasn't happy. Okay, so the rest of Becky is, she wants to go on this white boat, and she teaches herself to swim, so there's a lot of her lying in rock pools for no apparent reason, which side effect she learns to swim. We don't know exactly when it is. Her father, who beats her, by the way, for no apparent reason, refers to Londinium, so that's Roman London. But then there's a priest who has a lot of control over the village, and they're all worried about evil and sin, so it's obviously post-Roman. Christianity didn't really get that much of a fixation on things until after Roman times. I don't know what they're trying to do there. Becky swims out into the bay, is taken up by the white boat, and then she's angry that it's taken out and spends the whole time clinging to the mast and vomiting, and she's angry about everything, and she's still barely verbal, so I've got no idea what's happening. She goes sailing with it, and then she comes back with it. And she finds out they're smugglers, and that's okay, but then it isn't okay, so she steals something they're smuggling, which is inadequately described, so I've got no idea what it's meant to be, except maybe it's slightly machine-like. I don't know what this book is all about. Is it meant to be an alternative history? Is it meant to be set in the past? I've got no idea. I would love to hear from anyone who did. Actually, if you did, tell me, but I'm still not going to like this book, this story, no matter what you say. Oh, then she's kept captive in her house for no apparent reason, and the priest has called some soldiers who arrive with soldiers mounted on horses, but also cannons, and they're going to do something horrible to the white boat. Only Becky escapes from her room and makes one of them malfire so the boat escapes. If there was a point to all this, I am scuppered if I know. Okay. Story number 3. I now know these are stories, so hooray for that. And I started a real book to accompany my grudging progress through the Grain Kings. The Passing of Dragons starts with a zoological physical description of dragons, an anatomical detail of which made me quite happy. And there seemed to be a story structure and 2 actual characters, no stream of consciousness, thank goodness, and actual dialogue. So I was cautiously positive about this. We're on a planet with the native species that looks a bit arthropod-like, only with a vascular system similar to mammals. People are calling them dragons. They've got 6 or 8 hearts. They're slowly going extinct as humanity devastates their entire planet. The planet has valuable mineral deposits, which humanity is stripping, so everything, ecological speaking, is going extinct, including the dragons. We have 2 characters. Our POV character is a behavioralist, behaving like a scientist, who's gathering data on the dying dragons. The other one is the pilot of the ship that got him there. Pilot first class, we kept being told, without being told why that matters. Behaviorist is a sarcastic, nasty a-hole. I guess he's meant to be entertaining in his sarcasm and his nastiness. He spends his whole time baiting the pilot, who's highly trained, idealistic type, maybe a bit dense in his clean-cut way. And this is mainly about the scientist baiting the pilot until bad things happen. I mean, it's a well-written story. It's deeply depressing on the behalf of the ecological devastation. The intellectual cruelty isn't my thing. Don't know the point of it, if it had one. The next story is The Trusty Tree. Again, third-person POV. This is Robert's thing, isn't it? Omniscient POV, by the way. So there's some human who's injured on a boat floating down a river. Eventually I figured out it was a canal when he talks about changing levels, and rivers don't do that. We're told it's an alien planet called Xerxes, and that he crawled his way to the river canal, where he was found by aliens called Kelti. These are the boatmen of Xerxes who spend their whole life on these long boats travelling. carrying cargoes from one place to another, even though there's no settlements. Won't go into that. They kind of gave him medication, then dumped him on deck, and he thinks they're heading towards this particular place where there's human civilization, maybe a hospital. He's very sick. He's obviously dying. He keeps taking painkiller medication, and it's mostly, honestly, him musing on the colour of the skies and the leaves above him, and reminiscing about some girl, I think, as well, and the sound of the water against the ship, and him finding humour in small events. It's pretty in its own way, like a poem is pretty in its own way. I guess it's meant to be a character study in a way, because there isn't really anything much except this person. It ends badly. All of Roberts' seem to. The Lake of Tuonela, same world as the previous story, Xerxes, and it's got a similar different theme. Again, we're on a boat from the boatman of Xerxes. This time, however, it starts with an actual character and an event, which was a pleasant change. You've got this person whose name I've forgotten, and I don't really care. Oh, Matthias, something like that. He's got leave coming up, and he wants to spend it travelling through this particular set of canals and tunnels that haven't been used for a long time. He believes that they're passable, and that if so, they could re-establish contact through the canals, which would be cheaper and perhaps more effective than humans putting in lots of roads with road vehicles on them. He is denied, so of course he goes ahead and do it with a single atypical boatman guide and his boat. We're told he's atypical because he doesn't get married at age dot, and he actually speaks some human pidgin. So this journey, it's all quite pretty. There's canals and there's locks that are described, and then we go through a tunnel and that's described. We found a lake, I think it's an underground lake. But honestly, most of the story is Matthias spending his time musing about his life, and again, there's some girl that he thinks he sees while he's dying at the end. I just didn't care that much. It's pretty, but whatever. Eventually, we reach the Grain Kings. Hooray! The story that the whole book is named after. The story that will allegedly be about the overpopulated planet and it's the hungry suspense and these huge combines marching towards each other and everything that's going to be awesome, evocative, and we reap therefore and we thresh grain for half the world. It could have been not have been more anticlimactic if it had tried, if it had been designed to disappoint the person who'd read that background. Or perhaps Panther allocated someone to write the back of this book and hadn't bothered to even glance at the story or talk to Roberts about it. I don't know. Yes, there is a huge grain harvesting combine. It's named Patsy, by the way. I think it's being run by Americans. There's a whole heap of them being run by Russians as well. And this should have been very exciting, but we don't see much of it. And we see it through the eyes of one Harrison, who is deeply depressed. He's a reporter. He's got him on board along with a photographer and a photographer aide to write a story about the harvesting combine. So we have about half a page of him being shown around the Undercroft and how interesting everything is happening. But all the rest of it, and it's not the shortest of these stories, is him being depressed and miserable over the fact that he broke up with some woman once. We see him drinking coffee, sipping orange juice, drinking whiskey, and then more coffee, and sometimes an English, not American beer, until the end, where he has an American beer. Plot development! We see sweet F all of the combine, nothing of this story. There is a point where a Russian and American almost collide, but they don't. There's one throwaway comment by a crew member about World War III starting if they crash, maybe, only it doesn't. They don't crash. Then Harrison has a one-night stand with the photographer's assistant, and now, oh great, we get to eavesdrop on Harrison thinking about her as well as his previous ex while he sips on coffee, whiskey, English beer, and orange juice. The exciting event with the Russian combine happens about 2/3 of the way through. Up till then, it has been boring as... I won't say it. I might get edited. We get a paragraph or two of the thing with the Russian Combine before we have to put up with Harrison thinking more about Allison and drinking more whiskey. And he's a bit depressed. He's very depressed. This guy's an emo in 77. Anyway, at one stage he's really depressed because his magazine, National Geographic, maybe it's National Geographic, has decided to pull him off the story and replace him by someone else. But now that something actually has happened, they want to send in a big gun instead of him, who's kind of a hack. And I agree with the magazine. This guy isn't interested in anything, doesn't look at anything, doesn't seem to be writing anything. He is a useless reporter, and he is a pretty useless protagonist. He doesn't do anything. And he doesn't tell us anything. I wouldn't trust this joker to write a shopping list for me. And then he discovers that the one night stand isn't going to be his new love of life, and now he's miserable about that as well. One more to go. I'm gonna do it. I did it. I lose Medea. It is thankfully short. It is not short enough. It is, of all the stories in this dishonestly labelled cover, it is probably the most interesting. Some guy and his girlfriend Medea driving up to a field, the darkness is falling, they have to put up the tent before the field ghosts arrive. Once the tent is up, their own personal ghosts will drive away the field ghosts. None of this is ever explained. Medea starts preparing dinner. Our protagonist, no longer worried by ghosts, goes looking at the war that's about to happen. There's 7 castles, and there's a whole heap of armies, and at first I think they're all ghost armies, and that's the point of the ghosts, but no, he can talk to them. They're from mixed points in history. I think there's Tudors, there's cannons, there's a whole heap of different shit that makes no sense. He walks through for a while, he comes back, he has dinner with Medea, they have a fight. Awesome. Not. Some other people are set up in the field for no apparent reason. All of this story is no apparent reason. I think that Keith Roberts actually thinks that it has a punchline. And I'm not going to tell you in case you too think it's a punchline. But the whole thing is entertainingly pointless, but pointless. And not for a second am I suggesting that Keith Roberts is a bad writer. He clearly isn't. His writing is lyrical, evocative, contemplative, very well edited, and in many regards, it's quite beautiful. It's just that it's barely sci-fi. The fact that he mentions that there's a combine harvester and the world starving doesn't make it sci-fi. It just makes it a throwaway concept that has no bearing on my personal reading experience. If I want lyrical, I go to among the smoke and fog of a December afternoon, you have the scene arrange itself, as it will seem to do, with I have saved this afternoon for you. Eliot wrote poetry. He didn't pretend to write science fiction. This book really annoyed me. I've finished it. Whatever. It's very pretty waffle, but it's waffle. There isn't a lot of story. Eliot. I'd go for Eliot or Wordsworth over Keith Roberts if I was in the mood for that. However, if this sort of thing is the sort of thing that you think you're going to like, lots of pretty waffle with a couple of throwaway sentences to make you believe there's ghosts in the field or combine harvesters in the future, you go for it. If there is actually any science fiction that Keith Roberts writes, maybe this famous Pavane or one of the other books in the front. The Furies, Pavane, The Inner Wheel, The Boat of Fate, Machines and Men, The Chalk Giants. Maybe one of them is science fiction, and maybe I'll find out one day, but it's going to take a while for the unpleasant taste of The Grain Kings to leave my mouth. And I'm leaving it on my bookshelf so I don't forget it, and I'm making this review. Hopefully this review will mean that I will remember and treat all of Keith Roberts with extreme caution in the future. Thank you very much for watching me rant and rave. Read good books, and I will see you with a better science fiction next time, I almost promise.